This episode is the first in a pair of episodes, but they are in no way dependent on each other, where we talk about the strange peoples that are kicking around in the world of darkness. Some listeners like to wait until a whole series is out, but this isn't a series. It's something closer to Tomes of Magic, where the pieces are independent. Also, when we recorded this episode, we didn't know if our book, The Sphere of Gun, would come out. It did, and it's on Storyteller Vault. I did 9 firearms, one for each tradition, as a kind of spoof take on the tradition blades from Revised, and Pook did the Minor Sphere of Gun. It is available as pay what you want. All the proceeds are going to support those who have been victims of gun violence. Finally, the 1-point wonders for our Oracle supporters are done, and I will be sending those out in the next few weeks. I'm also working with Rusted Icon to make something special for executive producers who've been kind enough to support us for multiple years. I didn't know we'd be approaching episode 300 when I started doing this around episode 25, but I'm so glad for everyone who's come along for the ride and shown their support. On with the show. Hi, Mage fans. This is your host, Terry Robinson with Mage, the podcast. Joining me today is Pook from Changeling, the podcast, and we're going to talk about some of the weird peoples of the world of darkness. Because in the world of darkness, there's this level where, like, there are sweet, generous entities out there that are kind of special and magical, and no one's quite sure what they are. And that's fine, but things get really complicated when there's like 15 of them. And we're going to go over that.
As many as 15.
As many as 15. So 2.5 times more abundant than the children of knowledge, which is my basic unit of peopledness. Before we go into the show proper, though, I would like to point that one of our Discord users has done a lovely job of colorizing a number of the old Langdon Foss, Jeff and Roy Lobenstein, and to a lesser extent, Leif Jones art pieces from Revised. We think it is user Bertamus or Bertakamus. Yes. I will include both, and hopefully I can just edit out the one that doesn't work, and it will not be somewhere in between the two. But Revised used a much more comic book style with a lot more white space as opposed to filling it with black ink and so on. And that produced a result that lends itself to colorization. And I think they look pretty keen. So link to that will be in the show notes.
The one that I want to see is from Sorcerer Revised, where it's the one that does very just comic style line work. I forget which artist it is, but it's the guy with presumably the fortune path in a wheelchair rolling across the street and just like throwing a little die into the air while there's like a 20 car pile up around him. So that it'll be a nightmare, but I think Bertakamus could rise to the challenge. Let's play Find That Page and see who wins.
Find the image.
I can visualize exactly where it is in the book, but let's see impressive. If I can get a page number. I went exactly to the page 77 of Sorcerer Revised.
Wow, that's amazing.
Here it is for...
I have it. Oh, yep. I think it's Langdon Foss, because if you look at the front license plate of the bottommost car, it says Foss 00.
Just below the Nader bumper sticker.
That is a genuine in the wild Nader bumper sticker. How about that? You can tell it is truly a dark world.
Yes.
Would you start with the Tuatha and the Fomorians?
I would. All right, so they're kind of a matched pair, so I wanted to talk about them together. And these come straight out of Irish mythology. In particular, a book called the Leabhargabhal Éireann, which is the Book of Invasions, is the commonly used English title. So this is one of the original sort of creation myth epics of Irish mythology. And that book tells of how the Fomorians were these sort of monstrous overlords of Ireland that the various waves of people who came to the island, the human settlers, battled against. Eventually, the Tuatha de Danaan, which is purported to be Irish for people of the goddess Danu, but it's unclear who Danu actually was. They show up.
Don't know who Danu is?
Precisely. We just have the genitive of her name. But they have all these magical treasures, they have all these powers, and they struggle for dominion against the Fomorians.
And the idea is, though, in the Irish history, are they humans? Do we know? Is that idea even there?
They're humanoid, or they're humans but better. I mean, they're very like the Greek gods in the sense that they are anthropomorphized, but they have these massive powers. And they are beautiful to the Fomorians, hideous and chthonic, sort of.
Are the Fomorians literally chthonic? Do they emerge from the earth?
They are said to have emerged from underground or under the sea in particular.
Interesting.
They're very tied to the water off the coast of Ireland.
Okay.
So when you do like comparative mythology and stuff, this is the same kind of like Olympians versus Titans, Aesir versus Vanir that you see, Asuras versus Devas, and all of the Indo-European mythologies. And so people have said that's probably what it reflects. Eventually, the ancestors of the Celts arrive and they fight against both sides until they finally defeat the Fomorians. The Tuatha defeat the Fomorians, and then make a truce with the mortals, where the humans will take the above ground and the Tuatha will take the world below, which is the other world. This is how they become the people of the hill, in Irish being a she. So with all of that, Changeling pretty much spun that into a backstory for the Fae. There were like little allusions to it in the earlier part of the line because those myths informed the actual fairy lore of Ireland, so they were part of that kind of Celtic fairy tale texture of the game. But it actually gets spelled out in the book Court of All Kings, which is the first edition Ireland setting / chronicle book. I have a quote here, so I'm going to just pull that up real quick. So in that book, there's a sidebar that says the origin of the Fomorians, which says, born of the fear-filled dreams of the earliest settlers in Ireland, the Fae, known as the Fomorians, or Fomora, probably messing up the Irish on that, were nightmare creatures with gigantic monstrous bodies and twisted minds. It is unknown whether they took their name from the human tribes or from a great chieftain or leader among them. Terrible in warfare and frightening in their command of the nascent magic, which would come to be known as the arts of the Fae, the Fomorians demanded and received tribute from their human creators. So cruel and greedy were they that many of the humans fled to Scotland and into remote isolated areas where the Fomorians could not find them. They can't deal with Scotland. The Tuatha, by comparison, are described as tall, fair, and beautiful, greatly skilled in the magical arts, godlike in their powers, and wrapped in glamour. So the latter are more human-ish overall, but after the mythological stuff kind of plays out, the Tuatha vanish into the dreaming and leave behind their children, the kiths of the changelings, led by the Sidhe. And the Sidhe are described here as being the ones closest to their parents.
Is there a place where we get the tie between the Tuatha and the kiths being tied to story and legend?
Kind of. So it evolved over time, over the course of the line.
Because my interpretation was the Tuatha were so great that even their names conveyed power, and the only way to add any of their majesty to the world was through great stories, because they were not physically present. Their magic was too great to even be understood by mortals. So only through stories could they even possibly be embodied. And our limited artistic powers of I assume the Iron Age or whatever, or the Bronze Age, was so weak that only our greatest epics at the time could contain a hint of their power, which would then empower the kith, a single kith or something like that. But that's...
Terry, this may shock you, but the books are contradictory and unclear. So where we get the most information about them probably is the kith books, where in the sort of deep history of each kith, it's like the Mythic Age, and a lot of them have the story, these mysterious godlike beings appeared and awoke us to consciousness. So when we say like, oh, the Slua are sprung from the dreams of things that go bump in the night, or the Puka are sprung from the dreams of like, animals frolicking and being free in nature and everything. It's like the Tuatha are like the monoliths from 2001. They take those dreams and give them sentience. But beyond that, there's not a lot about their actual activity until you get to the very late in the line book, Denizens of the Dreaming. Some in Dreams and Nightmares, but mainly Denizens in the Dreaming, where they talk about the War of the Trees, which is the war between the Fomorians and the Tuatha, whether or not the changelings or the changelings before they were changelings participated in that fight is kind of left unclear, as is the exact timing of it. It was somewhere long before, the early days of human civilization. That's kind of like the final recast that Changeling has of the backstory, where the Fomorian dream was like the first and nightmarish state of things in the early days of humanity, and then the Tuatha fought this war, which then informed C20's take on the deep history. Yeah, it gets a little bit confusing. One more like addendum to this, which is optional canon, is that in the book Time of Judgment, the Tuatha actually come back and they
just
are
fuck
pissed.
Up everyone.
Yeah. So the idea in there is that there was an oath where the Fae swore not to mingle with human blood. This is also carried into Dark Ages Fae. And when the Tuatha come back and see that, oh, you've been like incarnating for centuries, we're going to slaughter all of you. So they're also presented as insanely powerful in that context. Like even the lowest of their scouts is able to just sweep the floor with, your finest dukes.
And I like the idea that and this is something that I would find interesting in that, like, the progenitors would look at. And the word you used was they could wake these kith, that they're these like kith-like objects kind of floating, free-floating, these archetypes. And they were the ones that had the ability to create it in a particular form, and without their proper tending, we get these malformed or possibly wondrous other kinds of kith that can float around. And when you say nightmarish for the Fomorians, is there interpretation where it's just kind of alien? Like in the same way that the High Umbra is refined thought and the Middle Umbra is kind of the spirit of nature. Is there a similar dichotomy that kind of the Tuatha have this civilizing aspect to them, or no?
So the Tuatha are presented as having, I wouldn't necessarily call it a civilizing aspect, but a hopeful aspect in the sense that I actually quite like the ways the C20 core book presents it, where they say the dreaming sort of brought forth the Fae in response to humans' desperate need for hope in the Fomorian world that they lived in. But beyond that, I mean, beyond the capacity to dream being aspirational, they're not really sort of categorized or distributed beyond that. The Fomorians, on the other hand, have a trichotomy. Should I pause it? Okay. So there's the white court, the red court, and the green court. The white court are manipulators and planners and schemers, very cunning, sort of like beyond human conceptions of manipulation. I like to think of them as the gentry from Changeling the Lost. They're just like, the red court are massive forces of destruction. Like, I'm going to go knock this mountain over, that kind of thing. And the green court are just said to be unfathomably powerful and inscrutable. I go Lovecraftian when I talk about them because I think of them as that. They were the ones that were not defeated by the Tuatha. They voluntarily chose imprisonment under the Sea of Silver. That's how the Fomorians divide. Kind of different.
Do the Tuatha have groups, or is it just the Tuatha?
Just the Tuatha.
Okay.
I mean, as far as I can remember from the books, just the Tuatha.
I would love to do a book of Deep World of Darkness lore where just periodically you do this name / this name, and it would be something like the Tuatha / the Huija, and just make these arbitrary claims that these two different groups are actually the same thing within the world. Yeah.
Well, and it's the Tuatha de Danaan. So what if there are other Tuathas out there of the god or goddess so-and-so? Yeah. And like
the Tuatha de Yoplait.
Yeah, precisely. I always hated that fruit on the bottom stuff. That was like the worst. But for a mage game, so I had a couple thoughts about like what you could potentially do with this. The Fomorians' servants, the sort of dark equivalent of the changelings, of the Kithane, are the Thalane, and a lot of them are committed to corruption and causing chaos and all that kind of stuff. Very easy to get in bed, figuratively or literally, with the Nefandi. There's also the possibility of those Fae inspiring Nefandi and gaining dark glamour from the chaotic nihilism that they create, etc. I was thinking it would be great to have like a chaotic nihilists anonymous meeting for Thalion and Nefandi on like Tuesday evenings. They all get together and they're
like, the Kalasha and the
like, I just want to destroy a sewer system. See what happens.
This all goes back to the Victorian game that we're eventually going to do.
Yes. Sidebar. The other piece with the Fomorians is that in the context of the Changeling canon, they are said to be stirring and waking up. And so maybe the Nefandi want to help raise those.
And waking and talking. And
there must be some kind of yogurt-themed pun about stirring.
Well, I mean, because the biggest thing is, what did the Tuatha bring to the British Isles? Culture.
Yeah, and possibly stone circles. But we'll get to the wick later, because that's the other...
Culture was my dairy joke. I'm sorry.
Yeah. You could also have, though, any mage who deals with the Fae, be it a Verbena or a Marinita. I mean, they've probably heard of the Tuatha at least and have some idea of their relevance. You could have, like, an awkward moment where like a pagan theist mage is like, oh yeah, I have, Dagda in my pantheon or something, and the Fae are like, oh, that guy?
Is that Dagda in your pantheon, or are you just happy to see me?
Oh, her,
that
my great grand Fae.
And the Tuatha appear in both editions of Scion. And Scion in general, I haven't known it to do a bad job yet about presenting a pantheon. The important part to me is the Uzata are in there, my pantheon bay. I didn't realize there were so many books and TV series that mention them at this point. Like, it pops up in American Gods, the Irish Druid Chronicles, the Artemis Fowl series, the Chronicles of the Invaders, the Hounds of the Morgan.
Well, when you consider they are as significant to the pre-Christian Celts, or the Gaels specifically, as the Greek pantheon was to the ancient Greeks. Like, that was their religion. So yeah, I mean, they were...
And I guess one final thing, and this wasn't in our outline, but is this a pantheon with a theme? Is it one of those things where, like, for instance, Greek myth only made sense to me once I had an idea of Xenia as a concept, the Greek idea of hospitality and right action that wasn't quite the 8-spoke path, but it's like, for F's sake, someone comes to your door, offer them a chicken.
Or a goat.
yeah, as the case
Better not take your figs. I don't know that there's a single unifying theme. I think there are themes within the lore. So like some of the ones, there is like a guest right thing that comes up frequently. The permission for like the bards to kind of speak truth to power, the perfection that's necessary in rulership. So like if you're physically blemished, you can't be king. Yeah, I mean, there's stuff like that comes up which reflects the Irish culture, but I don't know that there's a unifying idea for the Tuatha as a whole, save that they're like us, but weirder and better in a lot of ways.
The Tuatha, they're just like us.
Yeah. In the legends, you have all these individually named ones, but you also have like treasures and places and things, concrete things you can point to and just pick up and drop into a narrative as needs be.
And on the Mage side, I kind of like the idea, though, that I know within Time of Judgment, or I can't remember where it ultimately landed, but there was House Danaan, whose goal was to protect the Silver Paths or something like that.
That was their goal in that, but they are now also a core house in C20.
Well, never mind.
With a different goal.
Yes, to modify it slightly, I like the idea that no one has ever seen a Tuatha, but people have seen their agents, which may or may not just be a cultural expression, but it's this thing that everyone can point to and being like, even they are powerful. What do? I also like the idea, as you mentioned, that their return is only apocalyptic.
Yeah.
That in some way, like you have the idea that within the Bali, we must keep committing atrocity. Otherwise, these dark entities will wake and consume reality. We must keep creating. We must encourage culture and art and beauty. Otherwise, these entities will return, deem reality ugly, and just scour it. So there are people frantically creating poetry and mosaics to keep their dark god aslumber.
I missed whatever the third word of that thing you just said was in the blank, but my brain turned it into Bollywood. And now I just love the idea of Bollywood fending off the collapse of...
Well, Hollywood didn't have enough people on screen at the same time, so there wasn't enough quintessence generated, especially the movement to CG.
Yeah.
So a 700-person dance scene where everyone is holding citrus is the only way.
Very glamorous. Changeling in particular, though, kind of leaves you guessing with the Tuatha because Arcadia is unknowable. I actually get really frustrated when you see people try to spell out what Arcadia is, because I'm like, no, it's so far in the dreaming and so shrouded by layer after layer of the mists that it cannot be conceived, nor can, if the Tuatha are even still there, can they really be scrutable. The Fomorians are different. The Fomorians are locked in layers of the dreaming that changelings maybe not regularly go to, but can go to, and so they're more thoroughly described.
Is there a redeeming side of the Fomorians? Is there they were just the losers?
I guess it depends who you ask.
Do we have canon evidence that supports, hey, they may have been onto something? Kind of like the way you get this fight in a lot of cases between Nature A and more cognizant spirits.
I think there's been a shift in that, whereas they were first more presented as creatures of banality, they are now presented more as creatures of dark glamour. Okay. And dark glamour is still glamour. It may not be a dream you agree with or want to live in, but it is different from the extinction of all emotion and change and whatever. So if that redeems them, the Shadow Court might say absolutely it does. You know, whether or not as a game runner or as a player you think that makes them redeemable.
Narratively, at least. They themselves, they don't need to go through a redemption arc. But because I always think of, for instance, in the rare cases where I have a cultist in my game, I generally want to see the 2x2 matrix of positive, negative emotion and positive and negative outcome. I kind of want that 2x2 square to be hit, where it is like envy and rage have fueled me to do something beautiful and great, and love has caused me to destroy, or something like that. And I didn't know if there was that angle where, like, the Fomorians, we get the idea that there is something wrong in the world of Changeling, in that there is not the shift between the Seelie and the Unseelie, that the world has become unbalanced because of this. And I don't want it to be the same as like the Yama Kings, where it's like, no, it's we have a contract. We get to make everything hurt for 10,000 years, and then you get to have fun again. I'm always interested in saying, in finding the good parts where it's like, no, the Fomorians are necessary and important and represent something that can be used well, but just either due to propaganda or culture or not knowing how it works, bad thing happens.
I think that's certainly on the table
Okay.
in the game. Yeah.
But it's not necessarily something that comes to the fore.
No, not really.
Any other thoughts about the Tuatha or the Fomorians before we move on?
They're squoodly and inscrutable, and yeah, no, that's all. There's a sidebar here on Treasures of the Tuatha de Danaan. So the Leophile Stone of Destiny, which shrieks when touched by the rightful king, the Spear of Lu that guarantees victory, the Sword of Nuada, which is inescapable, and the Cauldron of the Dagda.
I am now going to talk about the peoples of the Hollow Earth, not including Nazis.
That's basically the only thing I know about the Hollow Earth. So
It's a good thing to know. Long ago, an ancient race visited from the stars and set up the Earth as their plaything. They were known as the Atlans, named after their first home on Earth. Later, for whatever reason, the sun had become poisonous and toxic to them. So I assume they were a very pale people. They had advanced technologies and they created races to serve them. The thing I find interesting is when they mentioned creating races, they then only describe robots. So I like to think they just had a very expansive definition of personhood, which I'm here for. Whenever someone talks about like Blade Runner and they're like, oh, it really makes you think. I'm like, no, it doesn't. If you can scream in pain, don't stab it. This isn't very complicated. The Atlans found the sun to become poisonous and they fled underground. The Atlans themselves, what happened to them may have left for the stars again. They may have been killed by their own creation. They may have been the progenitors of humans. They may have turned into something else. We don't know. But sometimes, if you go down a cave so deep, you will encounter a network of tunnels and passageways that transition from having rough-hewn walls to those that are smooth and gleaming as if carved by a laser and polished. And deep below the earth, you may encounter the Dero and the Tero. The Dero, or degenerate robots, and the Tero, integrative robots, were notionally created by the Atlans. The Dero were created long ago to serve, but they possibly too went mad. Maybe they were given bogus instructions. They like seemingly torturing humans at a great distance. The other origin stories we have for them is that the Etherites discovered Hollow Earth, this realm deep within the earth with different rules of paradox, probably sometime in the 20s or 30s during the height of the pulp era. They came up with plans for terrible weapons to implement peace on Earth, because the Etherites are really a big fan of Atoms for Peace and other such things, where it's like, if I can just kill everyone, they'll shut up long enough to stop fighting. And you're like, okay, good luck with that.
Hard to argue with that logic, but as solutions go.
Exactly. Some say that their plans and beliefs in this area had enough power to manifest these entities. Alternatively, there was a group or race or species there, and they got the Etherite plans, and the mad power that they possessed caused everything to kind of go sideways and created these terrible weapons that the Etherites had created. These robots are not to be confused with the Goro, who are a set of highly advanced monks that are also in Hollow Earth, usually tied with the nation or inner realm. We don't really get a definition of what an inner realm is, of Agartha. The Goro are peaceful and wise. They have a great library of all knowledge that is hard to understand and decode, and their ability was so great with technology that they were able to create items that did not succumb to paradox. The best known of those are probably the bolt guns that Dr. Eon has that are powered by Lemurian Mewstones or Moostones. And I don't know if we ever do an episode on Atlantis and Mu and everything. I think it could be a fun one. Hyperborea, all the places that don't exist anymore. We just have to ignore the theosophic angle.
Fun is a strong word.
What?
Depending which aspects you bring in, from what I know about those.
Yeah, just like everything else in the world of darkness. If you keep digging, you hit the Hollow Earth or anti-Semitism.
Yep.
And sometimes both
QV
the Nazis.
Yeah.
The Goro are depicted as having incredible powers of mind. Back to the robots, they were possibly used by Hitler's Third Reich, the Anna Yerba, the occult investigation group and served as his dark slaves, or alternatively, they were the secret ones manipulating what the Nazis were doing in the Hollow Earth to their own ends. I'm just glad at no point do we get the idea that Hitler was an underground robot. That's the important part. They seemingly look humanoid. We get one art piece where they look like this very kind of menacing, decayed version of IG-88 or another like cylindrical, tall, spindly robot that has been worn over time. They seem to be humanoid. They're probably tall and spindly. They seemingly have thousands of years worth of knowledge. As I look over to Pook, I'm starting to think, no. We get information about them in Beyond the Barriers, the Book of Worlds, and Infinite Tapestry, which goes a step further and suggests that these were realms that were reported on by the pulp author of the 30s, that there was a particular one, I think it's Robert Shaver, who they list, who found them and uses pulp media to report on them because none of the news will understand it.
This is maybe a ridiculous question, but I've never done a Hollow Earth game or like delved into this, but it is something that is a body of lore outside of Mage, correct? Like that is...
Yes, and they all point in kind of different directions. So the idea of microcosm, macrocosm is taken by some semi-philosophical natural philosophers to suggest as there is a world beyond, there is a world within. And when you and I hear that, we usually talk about like the world within the mind. And they're like, no, within the earth. And that the earth is hollow and it itself has a sun at its center, referred to as the smoky god. And that can reference all sorts of philosophical ideas. Halley of Halley's Comet fame believed in this or kind of theorized about it. It has been used to answer the question of, the mass of the earth isn't what we thought it would be. It's too dense or too light. How could that be the case? But the idea of there being large underground layers is a big thing. It also ties in that the two most common ways to reach the Hollow Earth are usually at the poles, which in Infinite Tapestry they refer to as the holes at the poles. And the idea of there being a tropical land somehow protected from the rest of the world is a recurring theme that we get in pulp adventures, the land that time lost, and so on. And the idea is that the first few expeditions to try and see the North and South Pole, generally the South Pole because that took a little bit longer, failed because not that there were technical issues, but they were repelled, or strange magics or technologies were used to confuse the expeditions.
Or they stumbled across Magneto's Savage Land.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So the powers and abilities. The Dero robots, these are the bad robots, work to destroy humanity or bother it at a distance. One of the characters is listed as indicated that all great crimes that occur to humanity are caused by these Dero robots. And he lists things like war, famine, plane crashes. And I'm like, there's a difference in scale. Yeah, that's a difference in scale.
Presumably earthquakes would be the easiest thing for them to do to cause
yeah,
to
but
wreak
they're
havoc.
in the earth. That's like you don't want to mess up your
punch
own
the
home.
ceiling. It's like when your neighbors are being too noisy and you just like rap with the broom on the ceiling.
I don't know, that feels more akin to me like the dolphins being angry at humans and thus polluting the waters to get back at them. Like that's not how I would do it. And again, there's different takes. Infinite Tapestry suggests that there's a bit more, that there is an Atlantis that existed, that it was populated by magi dolphins empowered by psychic crystals, because revised is street level.
Take a drink.
Yeah.
You said that pair of sentences like it was somehow a problem.
Working on Exalted has really redefined my notion of what street level is.
Playing Mage has just redefined my notion of what a street should be.
Yeah. So the Terror robots seemingly work to conceal the Dero robots, so they may have immense powers to shield and hide. They may be able to absorb and bleed off resonance to interfere with correspondence effects. Both of these seem to toy with distance as if it is no thing. It may be the case that they are taking advantage of resonant properties of the Earth to transmit these effects over great distances, which is why they're not very specific. Like, yes, we can have it go a long distance. I don't know where it's going to land. The Goro monks, on the other hand, are peaceful and capable of great mind powers. We get the wonderful scene where the thought amplifier using Goro ideas is used on Doc Eon, who uses it to mentally control the agents of the mechanocracy.
Beautiful.
Yes. This is most active in the period of kind of 1938 forward, at least per Infinite Tapestry, when this pulp author starts writing down all these stories. It's the lead up to the U.S. involvement in World War II. The books are ambiguous as to whether or not this is pre-existed or created by the Etherites. I like the idea that the collective belief in pulp literature and so on, plus the hope of the Etherite, kind of triggered this and created examples that other traditions may have. The Akashics may have instituted a wise old mountaintop hermit with knowledge of the true self, but also a group of ninja assassins trying to subdue his work. The Gone Away World by Nick Harkaway comes to mind.
I did want to ask, because the Hollow Earth to me as a mage concept just seems so solidly Etherite, and I wondered how much was actually in the books that does touch on other traditions.
We don't get the idea that it is anyway strictly theirs. It seems to be amenable towards a technomantic paradigm of some sort, and their adventurer background kind of inclines them towards it. I don't see a reason why someone else couldn't go there and do stuff fruitfully. It's just they kind of have a leg up seemingly against other groups.
Verbena be like, as above, so below. And the Etherite's like, hold my quantum plasm.
Yeah.
So
Hold my time tube. The ancient connection of the place, I think, is kind of interesting. If you have a character that is a conspiracy that before humans, that there was another group, by all means, my recommendation in all cases is don't take credit for ancient peoples and give them to some alien entity. But there could be a connection. Maybe the first monks of the Akashics, which is an idea that the Akashics were created to initially guard Mount Meru. The Huija may have a tie-in. Origins of the Celestial Chorus could be created to oppose this. Any group with an ancient connection of some sort could be pointed at it and be like, the real reason we're doing this is blah. That's perfectly fun. The Dero purportedly had technology that could cause mass hallucinations, erode free will, generate illusions, and simply kill at a distance. So I like the idea that the modern extropians of the Nefandi are interested in gaining these kind of earth-shattering powers. I also like the idea that other traditions are like, so what's this hollow earth about? And they keep finding their own things. One of the ideas we also get is this is a way to get to a shade realm of matter, which, if so, would represent a very rapid way to move to Jupiter, and that could have its own uses. But yeah, we got good robots, we got bad robots, we got psychic monks, all of them possibly on the background of Nazis. If you want to have the background idea that we got the Third Reich still running around out there, by all means, throw that in there. Again, show some sensitivity, but at the end of the day, if everyone's going to the South Pole to beat up Nazis, I think most people are going to be okay with that as a story.
are there not also dinosaurs?
There are dinosaurs.
Okay.
So the two interesting, so I looked into this.
It's just in my head as something that's part of the setting.
Yes.
Okay.
So there is a throwaway reference in, I think, the Society of Ether book where they talk about there being like primitive jungle peoples or whatever in dinosaurs, but actually in Infinite Tapestry and Book of Worlds, those are separate realms that are nonetheless accessible in similar ways. They make mention of Biotopia being one, and that being the one with dinosaurs, or it possibly being another way to get to the shade realm of Venus, or the Venusian. So it would be venereal, but that's kind of taken. Shard realm. What was that?
Cytherian is that's like the alternative adjective for Venus, I think.
Oh, neat.
Yeah, Cytherian. So when you talk about apogee and perigee, the Venusian equivalent is Apocythe and Parascythe, because that's like an alternative, and each planet has its own, which when I discovered this made my day. The Parajove and the Apojove for Jupiter.
That makes sense.
Like,
I got Jove, but I'm not a Jovan. As Pook mentions, it could be a gateway to discover other strange people tied with other Shard and Shade realms. Maybe one day we do an episode on the Shard and Shade realms, because I think I finally made sense of those, at least for me. It does that thing where it's like the authors didn't know that they had a secret lore that they were all agreeing on, but Terry, reader, has found it. Haha, smartest of them all. Give me a sticker.
I'll make you a sticker.
Thank you. I very much appreciate it.
It's going to be Ptolemy's head. I'm just like,
yeah.
Anyway.
The other interesting thing is we never get any information that these are spirit creatures. So the part to me that is interesting is we get the idea that there are a class of entities that are always materialized in some way, and these may be those, or it may just be a sign that the Etherites just don't care about the sphere of spirit. So, any thoughts on the Dero, Tero, or Goro?
They all sound marvelous. I will admit it's not psychic monks I can get into. Robots have never been something that I've been particularly keen on as a story element, but
What is it about it that you don't like about robots?
It's not that I dislike them. I just don't feel drawn to them in the sense that, like, the kinds of stories that I want to tell fundamentally are exposing things about the human condition. And I feel like, yeah, of course you can do that with robots, but you're starting from one degree of separation. And maybe I just don't have the patience to like jump over that. They're fine. Like, if someone said, oh, do you want to play in a robot game? I'm like, yeah, okay, that's fine. But what would interest me more in like the Hollow Earth setting in particular is like the process of exploration, trying to make sense of the mechanics of it all and getting to use fun terms like, Mohorovic discontinuity.
Which was in my most recent game. That may have popped up when we were playing
how
Invisible
often
Sun.
do you get to drop that into a Mage game? And that is relevant to Journey to the Hollow Earth. You're going to have to get through that discontinuity and the asthenosphere.
Yeah, the asthenosphere. What is the discontinuity?
It is, I think it's the boundary between the asthenosphere and the lithosphere, but it's when they did Project Mohole too. It's like whoever branded that one, that was what they were aiming for because that's like the short version is the Mohole.
I like the idea of just presenting them as if they are basically a human culture except for this longevity thing. And I am always a fan of like people projecting a certain non-humanity onto them because again, I see agency in the notion of consciousness to me is a continuum, as is the notion of sapience. So to me, the minimally conscious object in the world that we interact with is a thermostat.
All right. Yeah.
So, and it's always interesting to be like, oh, wow. As we were talking about Blade Runner, it's like, wow, it's really interesting. That these robots scream when you shoot them in the face.
Maybe this also comes from me having more of a background in like the social sciences than in something like psychology. It's also, I think, this is probably why I didn't care so much for Picard season 1.
Okay.
Because it's questions of sapience strike me as preludes to questions of society and culture. Important prelude, but still a prelude. And I find the second step much more engaging. Yeah. So
number theory is cute, but I need to do my taxes right now. Yeah. So those are the Dero, Tero, and Goro. Learn more at your local library. What do you got next, Pook?
I have the Firstborn.
Ooh.
And these were, I think someone suggested these, and my assumption is that we're talking about the Firstborn from Dark Ages Fae, because that's where those jokers live.
There are 3 different Firstborn that we get throughout the World of Darkness. One is the one that you mentioned from Dark Ages Fae. The other one is that they are the first mortals that have the ability to do magic, but they are so great and potent that they, for whatever reason, fade.
I've got them later on in the list.
And another one is that the Firstborn are that there is some primordial peoples, and I think this pops up in the Verbena creation story, the Eudina, and they are able to mate, and they create the first humans that have a thing, and they are the first born as opposed to the first to simply be. What is the fancy liturgical term? Aseity, requiring no prior existence. But yeah, there's a whole bunch of different times Firstborn comes up, and you're talking about the
Fae expression of that, and the other 2 are in the Wick write-up. But so yeah, the Firstborn in Dark Ages Fae claim to be the first beings who arose in the primordial chaos or what have you, and then in the Dark Ages Fae setting, you have what are called the Mists. Different from the Changeling Mists. In this context, it's the pure chaotic power from which everything is made and can be reshaped, but not unmade. So the creation story is that the Firstborn just kind of created bodies for themselves and shaped or weaved the mists into the world around themselves so that they would have a home. Through reasons too complicated to get into for this episode, eventually humanity arrived, and the Firstborn were kind of charmed and enchanted by them. The book actually posits that Eve was Firstborn and Cain and Abel were the first changelings, so take that, vampire. And the cosmology doesn't exactly line up with Changeling the Dreaming, except that there are broad tilts at similar ideas and terms with similar meanings, but not quite the same.
And if you're curious for more, I can't remember what Sorcerer's Crusade book has the weird origin of Eve as kind of the bringer of order, because Adam was just the first human walking around boning things and being like, no, please stop.
I remember this
embarrassing all of
passage.
us."
Yes. Yeah.
And because we're secretly the same podcast, both Mage the podcast and Changeling the podcast have done Dark Ages Fae episodes.
Yes.
So read more there. Links will be in the show notes.
Read/listen. So I have a brief quotation here from Dark Ages Fae describing what they look like, where it says, "The Firstborn are truly the embodiment of the horrifying or astonishing in their appearance. They range from creatures of the darkest and most perverse nightmares to the gentlest or most glamorous of angels. While Firstborn are humanoid in shape, normally, although stranger Fae creatures such as dragons and other monsters are technically considered Firstborn, their Fae heritage is usually obvious to those who know how to look." So they can have like weird ears, fangs, horns, eyes, whatever. They can have things where their hair drips with gold, or they spit frogs when they speak, like little echoes kinds of things that happen around them. There aren't Tuatha and Fomorians in the Dark Ages Fae setting. The Firstborn are kind of both of them and the She all rolled into one, or the true Fae all kind of at once. So unlike changelings, they don't have a human form because they're not incarnated into flesh. And they have to approximate a form by weaving the mists, and they usually practice by kidnapping mortals. So there's that element of the story. Within the context of Dark Ages Fae relative to Changeling, they more or less fill the role of the nobles. They have feudal structures and courts and stuff, just like the Changelings in modern times. And honestly, the Dark Ages Fae core book, it was a delightful chore to read, if I can frame it that way, because there's so many story hooks, and they're like, oh, well, in this court, the lady with frozen lake spray for eyes is trying to get this sacred treasure from the dude made out of leaves, and like all of these sort of really idiosyncratic ways to present this idea of like what you were saying before, the sui generis things that spawn themselves out of chaos.
The wonderful and terrible thing about the Firstborn is they're all unique.
Yeah, no. But like they have weddings, and they like to measure their age using different kinds of titles. And that's what I'm saying. I like seeing societies and cultures laid out in with these populations. They, in the history of the setting, spent some deliberately vague length of time, probably millennia, engaged in the War of the Seasons. This threatened to unmake the reality that they had created, so they took it outside, presumably to the dreaming, although they never used the term dreaming.
What was it? The Great Unleashing, where they tried to undo everything and that didn't work?
Yeah, it failed, and they made humans instead.
Yeah, oops. In the same way that the United States was a paradox backlash against the Syndicate trying to control Europe.
Womp womp. But they left oaths in place with the humans, and then when they came back, they were like, oh no, this is not.
Oh no.
So they stopped their war. The time frame of the Dark Ages setting, 1230 AD, is their 100-year truce is about to come to an end. And they're like, we're going to start having a war again. Do we have to take it outside again? So yeah, their abilities are quite broad. Because this is Dark Ages, if I were to relate it to Mage, I would frame it as they all have the same foundation and the same 4 pillars, which they call dominions. Those are dawn, day, dusk, and night, each of which...
I wish it were dawn, day, dusk, and night.
Yes. Well, or dark.
Yeah.
Like dark would have been fine. But yeah, each one covers that thing as well as sort of metaphorical associations. But they have very broad latitude. They have cantrips and unleashings. Cantrips being the spell-like things that changelings have, and unleashings being, I'm going to do what I want within the realm of possibility associated with one of these 4-way division of reality. A lot of latitude.
Yeah, a wonderful mix of strangely broad and strangely specific, where it's like, oh, this effect will only work against domesticated animals.
Right, but it will detonate all of them within a 100-mile radius.
Yes. The cattle bombs of southern Burgundy.
Yeah. I mentioned in the episode for Changeling the podcast on this book that I unfortunately have not actually had the opportunity to play Dark Ages Fae. Josh has, and talked about just like the wild power level, like combat in Dark Ages Fae, as he put it, whoever wins initiative wins, because they're just going to turn you into shrubbery and there's nothing you can do about it. You are just shrub now. So yeah, they have a lot of power. Really, I guess you'd use them in a game the same way you would use the She. So they're very magical, they're very pretty, they're somewhat stuck up, and they have an outsized amount of power relative to who they are, as well as a complicated feudal society for not really any good reason.
And they also seem to represent, and this is a thing that comes back with the Gentry, as you mentioned, in Changeling the Lost, of being this weird mix of incredibly hidebound and wildly creative.
Yeah.
And I could certainly see Firstborn that are still out there, and they've just been like, no, we're just taking a break. It's been 15,000 years, but we're just taking a break.
When I think about that pairing of like the stricture and the broadness put together, I think about storytelling as a concept where you have, so within a storytelling tradition, you tend to have certain ways that stories are meant to unfold, whether you want to call that the 5-act structure or whatever. But then within that, you can tell any story that you want. Where it gets interesting to me is when you discover a new storytelling tradition that is completely different. And you're like, oh no, we don't care about start at point A and get to point Z by going through every letter in between. It's like start with N, tell a totally different story on the side. Like that raises the question to me of like, what must other Firstborn society or like whatever population societies, what must they be structured like that speaks to that metaphor?
Yeah, my comparison would probably be music, where different genres care about different things.
There you go.
One of my favorite ones is their styles of West African music, where if you're not dancing, it's not considered music. It's just not, that's not in the art. Classical music cares about chord structure and dynamic control in a way that rock music doesn't, where it is much more interested in the interplay of harmony. Favorite is Tuvan music, prioritizes timbre over all other things. Pitch accuracy is just not important. No one really cares if you got the quote unquote right note, as long as it has the right sound quality to it.
The throat singing.
Yeah.
I can't do it.
I briefly learned how to do it while recovering from abdominal surgery. I was on pretty potent painkillers at the time, so I couldn't really think straight during the first like week where everything was just pain. So I was just sitting there and I'm like, what can I do? And I tried to learn the Kirksit school of throat singing. So I'm just sitting there in my house and I'm going like, hello. And I was able to do it eventually in parking garages because just I needed a little more resonant help. I couldn't quite get there myself. So the first few times I did it, singing requires muscles. So I was stuck the day after doing this for like an hour and a half. I couldn't walk, I couldn't really think, and I couldn't talk. So I'm like, oh, okay, this is going to be a day.
Did you ever set off every alarm in the parking garage and then knew you were a Firstborn? Because that would be...
sadly, I didn't, but I did do it at one point. There was one case where I was in a parking garage in Cincinnati, Ohio, and someone's like, man, Terry, you always talking about how you could throat sing. We never see you do it. And then I just did it. And everyone's like, holy shit, he could do it. And it was the only time I've ever been able to do it in public.
My favorite anecdote related to this is a tweet sent out years ago by Tanya Tagak, noted Inuit throat singer and performer, where she said, she's won lots of awards, well-deserved ones. And she said something along the lines, when a man criticizes me for breastfeeding in public, I just throat sing at him until he goes away. Like, there you go. That's the way.
Nice.
Anyway, the Firstborn. So yeah, like there's a couple points in the books where they try to hitch together the Dark Ages Fae setting with the Changeling, the Dreaming setting. Mm-hmm. It doesn't exactly lock together very well, but you can kind of massage it if you want. It's much easier to fit the Firstborn into like a historical setting, or maybe a game where the mages go deep into the dreaming, or the Firstborn somehow find their way into the Umbra. What I think would be really interesting is if you had them show up in a modern game for whatever reason and mess things up, because one of the things about Dark Ages is that they don't care so much about banality in the way that Changelings do. They care about Christianity, which are synonymous in the Dark Ages. But you know, if they showed up and they're like, yeah, we don't care about science, we care about that church, like that would be an interesting, particularly for mages who are familiar with the Fae, that would kind of be a skewed take on it.
The thing I was always toying with is that modern Christianity lacked something that was particularly lethal to the Firstborn. Like it lacked an element of true belief.
Yeah.
And suddenly the Firstborn come back and they're allergic to something else. Maybe a certain kind of blind, rabid patriotism.
Frankincense.
Yeah, it was very specifically frankincense. And I think it would be interesting to be like, oh, something has changed. We no longer possess this vulnerability. And as I mentioned before, the game I really wanted to do was either a group of Inquisitors or members of the Gabrielites that had, or the Proto-Gabrielites that just had a rolling carillon that had a sticker on the side that said, "This machine kills changelings." This machine kills Firstborns, and it's just a roving bell tower. But I like that even in Exalted 3rd Edition, the Fey embassy in heaven is wreathed by silver bells. And I just like that. Are there any unexpected places that you would see the Firstborn popping up in a Mage game?
Unexpected.
Unexpected to a Mage simply because they don't know what the Firstborn are.
An Akashic chantry.
Yeah. So an Akashic, a Firstborn, and a member of the Chilvoria are.
Well, to your point that you've made before about Fey magic having peculiar properties, fewer limitations, I guess you could say, I think that the Firstborn really drive that point home. Mm-hmm. And so that combined with their lack of interest in banality as modern changelings understand it, I think the technocrats would crap themselves. Like, you know, because the Firstborn
They're not
don't
using
care,
Christianity against them.
They don't care about disbelief. They care about belief.
Yeah.
So they care about
like
particular flavor of belief. So they're a plot device. You drop them into a setting and watch the ripples spread out as these assumptions that the different groups of mages have are kind of upended, whether that's about the nature of the Fae or about the nature of paradox and vulgarity and unbelief. You know, and it only kind of works. The Dark Ages Fae presentation is spare enough that you can make it work. You do kind of have to ladle in some headcanon of your own and whatever. But yeah, I think that would be how I would want to use them. So.
I also like the idea that there's one or two of them that are still out there in the parts of the Umbra that are unsettled.
Arcadia Gateway actually would be, if you wanted to use a pre-existing place within the canon, that would be where you could put them.
I like the idea of them being an Arcadia Gateway in the same way that like a modern knight would go to a medieval times and realize that everything is wrong, but it's still the closest they can get.
Or a Ren Fair.
Yeah, or something like that. I like the idea that near the Great Ocean, there is one that has one of the undone spires, is like, this is the closest I can get to the mists of that primordial uncreation. I like the idea of there being a digital one that is looking for unformatted sectors. Ooh. That is just kind of wandering near there, or one that feels that there is a space near the Well of Oblivion where reality is unmade, that gives it that kind of sense of indeterminacy that they find so homey. But yeah, I just like the idea of being like, what actually is this thing, and what's a weird place where I can put them?
The digital web actually is really interesting because presumably, like, you could map a lot of the same ideas that constitute the Firstborn onto it. Like, okay, well, whoever found, whether it was Alan Turing or whomever else in the context of Mage, whoever found the digital web first, what was already there? Mm-hmm. You know, what algorithm brought itself forward, and like run with that. Yeah.
The next one, and I think for the interest of time, the last one that we will talk about are the Djinn. They're a type of being that were purportedly first created by Allah, and they were the first entities with free will. They were grand and powerful and slow. They are a mix of spirit and matter. So when they are presented, they are generally listed as having rage, gnosis, power, as well as stats that kind of go with it. The thing that I find fascinating about that is, what's the other thing in the world of darkness that's listed as half person, half spirit? The Garo.
I was going to say.
Like, what do they make of each other? Like, we do get the note that in, what was it, Infernalism, Path of Screams, that the Garo are the natural enemy of demons. And I'm like, oh yes, of course, duh. And it gave it this like, oh, by the way, everyone knows this. I'm like, where were you getting this from?
Yeah. Yeah. I don't even think that makes sense outside the world of darkness.
Yeah.
Like,
they don't quite fit in the material world, and they don't quite fit perfectly in the invisible world, kind of what they refer to the Umbra as, but they can move freely between the two. They are wise and powerful. They aged very slowly, but they were eventually outcompeted by humans, specifically roughly 1,000 years before the start of the Common Era. Suleiman, depending on kind of the cultural context. I believe those are all generally felt to be the same figure. I wouldn't be surprised if that is heretical to someone somewhere, but came up with a set of rules to bind them, and was similarly working on a set of rules for demons. After Solomon is able to bind Al-Dimitra, one of the greatest and most powerful of the Jinn, the rest of similarly powerful Jinn are just like, nope, we're not going into that anymore.
F this, I'm out.
Yep, and they send their minions in what is referred to as the 10,000 Jinn plague, as they, to them, rose up to defend themselves. But at the same time, this assault caused the knowledge of how to bind Jinn to very quickly make its way across West Asia. They refer to mages as viziers. And I like that they say it kind of derisively, because it suggests that the mages aren't in charge. They are merely advisors to the mortals. And I do like that, like, oh, a vizier. And I was like, oh, what's the origin of the word vizier? And I look it up and it's like vizier, from the word vizier, meaning vizier. I'm like, oh yeah, you get that with other languages.
Wazir, I think is the root. So yeah.
If this 10,000 Jinn plague is to be believed, roughly half of their number are enslaved or captured in appropriate vessels, which must be fireproof, waterproof, and in some way sealed, generally with lead. They went quiet for an extended period of time and started to reemerge recently, but what is recently to a millennia-long lifetime of a Jinn. M20 suggests that Dubai is their hub of activity, which M20 creates a thing that doesn't really exist in previous editions, where it suggests that there are spirits regularly interacting with mortals in some sort of guise. This comes up in Gods and Monsters. This also pops up when we're talking about the greater kami, who purportedly hold court in material reality, which, if true, easily makes them some of the most potent entities to exist on the mundane side of reality. Which, if you want to have that hand grenade in your game, you can. But I just think it's kind of interesting.
How do they handle parking for their meetings? That's what I want to know. The kami are having a council and anyway, sorry, I'm just riffing. Don't mind me.
Well, they have the Tanuki to protect them, who are listed as bygones, but present in large populations in the mundane world, thus not having them be bygones. Gods and Monsters had a lot of interesting ideas in it.
Let bygones be bygones.
Yeah.
That's what I say.
If I had my full mixer board, I would be able to hit the rim shot button. There was another kind of critical event around the year 100 of the Common Era, the Devil King Age began, where a bunch of different kind of viziers approached and said, hey, we will help you free your people, get back at mortals, we will subjugate them. And it's suggested strongly that these are infernalists, and that for a long period of time in a particular area of West Asia, things are really bad for mortals. And even so much that the Jinn are like, yeah, we wanted them to go away, but you just seem to want to torture them. They're like, there's a lot of smell of roast flesh going around. And that's not great. At some point, the Jinn trick 3 viziers to create the city of brass. The viziers asked the Jinn to do it. The Jinn do it on condition that they have to live there, but they create a place so beautiful but hot that most of their magic has to go into just staying alive. The mortals leave, and then once the viziers die, it is ushered somewhere into the High Umbra. And one of the things that makes this really interesting to me is that they're listed as living in Jinnistan, makes sense name-wise, in the High Umbra, and we don't really have any examples of High Umbral places that aren't tied to a spire or the Vulgate or anything like that. And in older editions, that was sometimes brought up because we didn't have a fully enumerated cosmology. But in M20, it's listed as being high in the High Umbra. And I don't know what that means, which is both interesting and annoying, as frequently things like that are poorly defined are.
As the Umbra writ large tends to be.
Appearance-wise, they are suggested as being humans, but seemingly hot. They are either easy on the eyes or big and regal. We have Kingpin or Elektra, and those are the two options seemingly that we have. And I'm fine with that. That's perfectly okay with me. If you are looking for more information, Lost Paths is a wonderful source, but otherwise,
Cultures.
yeah. It also talks about the technocracy in the year 2000 backing the Taliban. And you're like, oh, that one didn't age too well either. In terms of powers, they seem to have potent dice pools. In both Sorcerer's Crusade and M20, they frequently get power ratings in the 50 to 100, which would make them some of the most potent foes if you were to compare that to the stat pools we get in like Werewolf. I think that is frequently done to be like, I don't want you to take out this character with combat. And spirits need to always win in the fight against humans. They have no problem granting service in exchange for power or agreements. They have very long lifespans, so be my servant for a year and a day ain't nothing to them. On the multi-century line, they start going, hey, buddy, hands akimbo, being like, I think someone's being a little bit greedy. A lot of the powers revolve around living well in a desert. They have considerable powers of trickery and illusion, as well as fast travel. Their peak period of time was before 3,000 years ago, but there are still a number of vessels in West Asia that contain Jinn in them somewhere. And one of the most potent Tuatha abilities is the YOLO rote, where it just unseals all Jinn in an area, which presumably you would only use in an area where there are sufficient Jinn for it to be a problem. Jinn can easily come to the mundane side of the gauntlet, but if they stay here for too long, they become weak. Maybe you have a Jinn that started out as a potent Jinn, but has been on this side of the gauntlet for centuries, and now there's something like a potent mortal sorcerer. I would also consider them giving them some of the super stats like we kind of got in Mummy, where Dexterity 6 allows you to take 2 actions in 1 turn or something like that. Something where it's a little bit beyond what a mortal could do, but not so much that it would seem like magic.
Is there any direct connection given in the books between them and mummies, since they occupy geographically?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't recall seeing any list between the two. They are great characters to show the idiocy of human mores in that they don't require creature comforts and have completely different notions of right action and hospitality. Well, if you were dumb enough to befall the social grace, obviously you were deserving of it. And kind of like we have the Taftani thing of mocking the Ali Batin, where it's like, oh, one god, quaint. Like the old Fae, they seemingly have a weakness for the powers of religion, but less so the belief and more the ritual of it. And this is one of those ideas to be like, oh, religion was originally invented to enact these rituals that created control in the world around them, and only later did the belief come to fill it in.
It's interesting that you bring up the Fae, though, because I'd be remiss if I didn't point out that in the Changeling 20th Player's Guide, Jinn is used as the term that West Asian Fae refer to themselves with. And I know that I've spoken with at least one cultural informant who kind of strongly disagreed with that choice and said, no, the Fae, as in Changeling, would be the Peri, who come from Peristan rather than Jinn. I don't even know if Jinnistan is really a thing. That's taking Arabic and Persian together, but
Ipsomobile and Autokineticon.
Yes, television. It's like a very Changeling adjacent or Fae adjacent concept, but the way in which it's laid out using mage structures turns it into something else.
Do you think it would be more appropriate to think of them like the Hsien, where it is this other creature, but Jinns aren't tied to mortals.
They'd be more like
way.
I'd say they'd be more like inanime in that they tend to be tied to objects. They tend to be very elemental. They're inanime with Kithane or Changeling sensibilities.
The other neat thing about them is they are listed as one of the few other spirity creatures that can fall to infernalism, and I find that parallel to be interesting. M20 gives it is written from the point of view of the Jinn, but they don't tell you that about how bad humans are and the terrible things that they did, and they just wanted to live and play and frolic freely till the terrible humans came. And I'm just like, this is a bit much. It only makes sense if you're already in on the joke, I think. And that was one of the failures, I think, of Gods and Monsters there. So do you have any thoughts about the Jinn?
It's an area of of Arabic culture in particular that I wish I knew more about. Because when I was a kid reading The Thousand Nights and a Night, and they would always kind of come up, it was like, oh, okay, yeah, this one is Muslim. And that for someone who didn't know much about that cultural framework, it was like, oh, wait, they can have religion just like humans too. And so discovering things like that, or like they can be petulant and they can be vindictive, but also they just like grapes sometimes or fish. And they have these very human needs and wants, which I don't want to say it's a failing of World of Darkness. I think it's an inconsistency, is when groups like this are presented as a complete other. And yet you could very easily just play a Jinn game. I mean, I think you'd have to do a lot of background reading and preparation and stuff, but you could have these fit very easily into the role of PCs. So I would love to play a game like that.
Yeah. And you bring up the Peri, the Peri angle, and that to me is interesting because it also brings up the whole idea of things like Swan Maidens, where it's just this other little bit different thing. What is it?
So many frailties. So many. It's not worth it to play one.
Does that come up in Changeling? Do we have Swan Maiden rules?
Or, yes. There is a Swan Maiden Kith. Yes.
Never mind.
Yep.
Of course. I forgot the answer to the question of, is there a Kith for it? The answer is yes.
Always.
Yes.
Always yes.
And I only know the term period because of having performed in Gilbert and Sullivan's Iolanthe, or the Pier and the Peri.
There you go.
Yeah. Amazing Act 1 finale, terrible Act 2 finale, which is generally how Gilbert and Sullivan rolls.
It was a fascinating exercise to go through and put notes together for this, in particular because generally, with the exception of the Jinn that I just mentioned, I am uninterested in playing games that focus on truly non-human or non-human adjacent characters. Because like when I play Changeling, I try to give as much emphasis as I can to the human side. When I play Vampire, I think clinging to humanity. I don't do the whole like Paths of Enlightenment thing because that to me gets away from one of the more interesting parts of the game. Mage, I like having mages who are still involved in human society to some extent. And the trap that I think sometimes comes up with these like far-flung places with weird and unknowable entities that may resemble humans but are entirely different, it gets away from what I think the game can teach you. Maybe sounds too grandiose. Illuminate about your own experience. But yeah, I mean, it is an endless well of just ideas. I mean, you could just go in so many directions and nobody's going to stop you.
To me, in a game focused on paradigm, I think it's useful in that it helps elucidate some things are just fashion. They are, I don't want to say unimportant because fashion is important in a critical way, but it is just an arbitrary choice that has no meaning that we all kind of agreed on. To maybe tradition, cultures, and mores where there's a reason we do it this way. It may not be obvious why we do it this way. And then things that are one step further where you look at cultures where it's like, oh, this resource is exceedingly rare, thus you behave this way. To, oh, this group of people has this common medical condition or is differently abled in this way, and that creates a different society. There is a spectrum of remoteness. And I think there are interesting stories that occur when you say, oh, if this little thing were different, this is what would fall out the other end. To, oh no, this is just an arbitrary choice that we have made as a people, and we could choose to be more kind or more cruel with almost no change. And I think a lot of these other peoples are like, what if this really were the most important thing in our lives? And these are the things that fall out the other end. Like the thing about the Djinn is, or the Firstborn, how does a person without a sense of time, without a sense of urgency, behave? Yeah. What does that look like?
I think you can run with the ones that we've gone through. I think the Tuatha and the Fomorians, they're plot devices. That's how you're going to have to use them. Yeah. You know, like it's going to be very difficult to have one just pop up as like a, hey, everyone. Firstborn, one step down from that. The Jinn, I think you could reasonably have like, if not a game where that's what the players are playing, then at least like an NPC who tags along because, yeah, they can come down to that level of, I don't know what term I want to use here. Intimacy, yeah.
And understandability.
Yeah. A comprehensible human experience, maybe. Yeah. If you want to run a kind of anthropological game like that, where the players are slowly discovering what Jinn society is like and what their culture consists of, I think that could be really interesting. But yeah, I'm into that.
Yeah.
I like that more than combat. So.
And again, Pook, thank you so much for joining us.
Yes.
For people who are interested, please go listen to Changeling the podcast.
Please.
Yeah, it is a wonderful show done by earnest people who do their homework and get good guests. And I think you encountered the weird phenomenon that I did in doing this, where it's like, oh, if you ask this author nicely,
Yeah.
they will come talk to you.
Yeah, people love talking about the things that they love. And yeah, that's how
And
it
telling
goes.
someone, hey, it's been 25 years, but there's several hundred of us who are quite fond of this.
I pointed out in our conversation a couple days ago that we are closer to the 50th anniversary of Changeling than the launch of Changeling, and there was this collective groan from everybody on the call. It's like
Yeah.
we're all grumps one way or another.
We're all grumps. Yeah,
Changelingthepodcast.com.
And stay tuned for our second installment and our soon-to-be-released supplement on the Sphere of Gun.
Yes. Coming soon.
This has been Mage the Podcast, where we never call our listeners strange peoples, even though as Mage fans we kind of all are. This show is made possible by our executive producers, who include the oracle of the following strange peoples: Ben Bendelow, oracle of the Tuatha de Danaan; Buck Gregory, oracle of the Fomorians, who go around spreading the idea that you're missing out on something really cool somewhere else; Christopher Phillips, oracle of the Dero monks, who mostly cultivate a starchy root to support themselves; Guy Stewart, oracle of the Dero monks, who supported the defendant in the Scopes Monkey trial; Jay Widener, oracle of the Firstborn from the upcoming OPP book series; Josh Hillerup, oracle of the Worstborn, whose spirits rise from sausages who are in long-term storage; Mikhail, oracle of the Mentry, the men's rights fairies kicked out of Arcadia; Pukaji, oracle of the Hentry, who abduct chickens to their weird otherworldly realm they simply call the coop; Sean Gallagher, oracle of the Secondborn, who are known for flinching whenever someone swats and having mostly hand-me-down clothing; the crew of Erebus, the Thirstborn, mascots of drinks like the Kool-Aid Man and those weird 7-Up spots that were really big in the 90s; St. UX Player, oracle of the Piri, who built the High Umbra. This is a joke on Piri being the name of a German scaffolding company, apparently; Jason Vines, oracle of Djinn, known for juniper and other botanicals, along with Archmasters Andrew Edelstein, Archmaster Brad the Blue, Archmaster Dan Svensson, Archmaster Derek Samsek, Archmaster Leroy Bryce, Archmaster Michael Parker, Archmaster Morgan Aran, Archmaster Nathan Weaver, Wolf Larison, Alex, Alexia, Ambiversion, Anders S., Anon, Badurfi, Birdo, Blaze Hibbert, Blake Ryan, Brandon, Bryce Perry, Bubba the Pale One, Chris Blake, Sin Shodas, Daniel Cuppin, Daniel Scribner, Darren Hennessy, David Roy, Dennis Osborne, Eli Levenger, Eric Schwenk, Fragerrock, George Laura, Gray Trilligage, Guy with Puns, Henry Kraft, Hugo the Bog Person, Ia Bull, Jason Duncan, Jason Kennedy, Jason W. Briggs, Jay Gatsby, Jeff Bryn, Jen, Jervis Johnson, John Magnuson, Jolyn Andes, Lawson Stuff, Kathleen Halperin, Chris Kinner, Leslie Weatherstone, Manel Canoas, Matthew Prohl, Michael Hopkins, Michael Creedle, Nibero, Neil Patterson, Nikita Klamenov, Oliver Schindler, Patrick McNamara, Patrick Mulder, Pax Cow, Rachel Grace, Ricardo, Richard Bat Brewster, Robart the Robot, Ryan Stray, Rob H., Ryan Kendi, Samuel Tobin, Sployd, Sev Nessus, Starfish, Stephen Carton, Steve Wynyard, Thrice Great, Tyler Bryan, Vincent Hamilton, Walter, William Connolly, and William Martin. Our EP shout-out is to Hugo the Bog Person, and I'm going to use this as an opportunity to tell everyone about the difference between a bog, a marsh, and a swamp. In terms of water activity and source, bogs typically receive all or most of their water from precipitation rather than from runoff or groundwater. This results in lower nutrient levels. The water in bogs is usually acidic. Marshes usually have a constant inflow and outflow from rivers, streams, or the ocean, making them rich in nutrients. They generally have neutral or slightly alkaline water. Swamps are similar to marshes in that they are often fed by groundwater or surface water, but they typically have more woody plants and trees. The water can be acidic or alkaline depending on the surrounding soil. Vegetation-wide, bogs are dominated by sphagnum moss, along with heather and low shrubs. Trees are sparse or absent. In a marsh, they are dominated by herbaceous plants such as reeds, rushes, and grasses, and swamps are characterized by woody plants and trees like the mangrove, cypress, or willows. Hugo, thank you for your support and the rich environmental services provided by bogs. Rather listen on YouTube, search Mage the Podcast on YouTube to find our full library there. If you super like this episode or super didn't, drop us a line at magethepodcast@gmail.com or at Mage the Podcast on Twitter. We have a hop in Discord community at discord.me/magethepodcast. Mage the Podcast is also on Mastodon's Dice.camp server at Mage the Podcast. If you like us, please give us a review on the platform of your choosing or tell a friend about us. Also go to Mage the Podcast for show notes and all of our previous shows. Now go change reality. Bye.